My daughter read every apology I ever wrote her, and she chose silence. That was the sentence I lived inside for 9 years. 43 letters. 43 answers that never came. I was clearing out my brother Paul's house the week after we buried him, looking for insurance records, and the bottom drawer of his desk was locked. The key was taped under the lamp base. Inside were my envelopes. My handwriting. Every one of them still sealed. Paul was the one who carried those letters for me. He was the one who came back each time and told me she needed me to let her go. I laid 7 of them out under the desk lamp, the way I used to lay out parts on a bench, and every red refusal mark sat at the same crooked angle. The same tilt, 43 times. Days after that, Paul's executor handed me a postal forwarding card. Emily's mail had been redirected 3 days before my first letter disappeared, and the signature on it looked like hers. The postmaster studied my envelopes and told me the postal service never made those marks. 9 years earlier, I missed her graduation because I was drinking again. Paul offered to carry the first apology himself. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 64 years old. I spent 38 years with my hands inside city buses, mostly brakes and air systems, and I have been sober 9 years and 2 months, which is the only number in my life I have never had to look up. Paul was 3 years older than me. He went down in his own kitchen with the kettle still on the burner, 67 years old, and the neighbor across the street called it in when the smoke alarm started. I got the phone call at 6 in the morning. I remember thinking, before I felt anything else, that Paul would be annoyed about the kettle. He hated waste. He left no wife, no children, and no mess. I was the only person with a legal claim to any of it, so the sorting fell to me. His house was the cleanest house I have ever stood inside. Every bin in his garage wore a strip of white tape telling you what was in it. Winter, taxes, tree lights, extension cords, outdoor. There was a little gray label machine on the shelf above his filing cabinet with a keypad on the front, the kind you buy at an office store, and beside it a stack of blank label rolls still in their plastic. I remember picking it up and putting it down. I remember thinking my brother was the only man I knew who labeled his own labels. His office had a desk, a chair with a cushion tied to the back of it, a laptop closed on a felt pad, and a shoebox of photographs on the shelf with rubber bands around it. His key ring sat in a dish by the door where it had sat every day of his adult life. 2 house keys, a truck key, a padlock key, and a small brass one, flat and dull, stamped with a number I did not think about at all. I was looking for the folder with his policy in it. That is the whole reason I opened the desk. The top drawers gave me warranties, a stapler, 3 pairs of reading glasses. The bottom one did not move. The key under the lamp base was a habit from our mother. She did that with the shed. I want to explain what those envelopes meant, because if you do not understand the arithmetic, you will not understand what happened to me on that carpet. I kept a list. Not because I am an organized man. Because in the first year sober, they tell you to write things down, and I never stopped. In a spiral notebook in my kitchen drawer, there is a page for every letter I ever sent my daughter Emily. The date I mailed it. 1 line about what was in it. 43 lines, starting the spring I got out and ending 2 years ago, when I finally accepted what everybody had been telling me and stopped. 5 a year, roughly. Her birthday. Christmas. The anniversary of the day I did not show up. Sometimes just a Tuesday when I could not stand myself. For 9 years the arithmetic went like this. I wrote. She refused. I wrote again. That was who I was, in the family and in my own head. The man who ruined it and would not stop bothering the person he ruined it for. My ex-wife Marianne stopped taking my calls somewhere in year 3. Cousin Godpolit. At Paul's funeral, a man I have known since high school shook my hand and said he was sorry, and then said, real careful, that he hoped Emily was doing well, and watched my face while he said it. I let all of them keep that picture of me. I thought it was accurate. So I sat down on my brother's carpet with the drawer open, and I counted, because counting was the only thing my hands knew how to do. 43. I counted them twice. Then I turned the top one over. The flap was sealed. Not torn, not slit, not steamed and pressed back down. Sealed the way I had licked it in my kitchen with the television on. I went through them one by one, and not a single flap on a single envelope had ever been opened by anybody. I did not cry in that room. I sat on my brother's clean carpet with 9 years of my own handwriting in my lap, and I tried to work out how a woman reads a letter she has never opened. I need to tell you what I did first, because everything after this depends on you knowing it. Emily finished her degree at 26. She paid for most of it herself, working days at a dental office and taking classes at night, and it took her 8 years to get across that stage. Marianne and I had been divorced 4 years by then. I had 14 months sober, and a job I had somehow kept, and I was going to sit in the 4th row with a camera I did not know how to use. The ceremony was at 4 in the afternoon on a Saturday. At 11 that morning I stopped at the gas station on Route 9 for cigarettes and walked out with a bottle instead, and I drank it in my truck in the lot behind a motel 4 miles from the field house, with the radio on, telling myself I would be fine by 2. I was not fine by 2. I was not anything by 2. Marianne called 11 times. Emily walked across that stage and looked into the section where the families were sitting, and my chair had her mother in it, and nobody in the seat beside her. I want to be plain here. I have heard men tell this story in church basements in a way that makes it sound like weather. It was not weather. I bought it, I opened it, and I drank it. 3 weeks later, Paul drove me to a facility 80 miles north with a duffel bag on my lap. He did not lecture me. He carried the bag in and shook the counselor's hand and told me he would handle the apartment and the mail, and he did. 90 days. I came out on a Thursday in August, and the first thing I did in my own kitchen was write my daughter a letter. I still remember what was in it because it was the worst one. 4 pages, and about 3.5 pages of it was me explaining myself, which anybody who has done this work will tell you is not an apology. I mailed it Friday morning at the counter in Ashford. Paul came by that weekend and said the thing that shaped the next 9 years of my life. He said, "Let me be the middle of this." He said Marianne was raw and Emily was raw, and if I came at either of them directly, I would set it back a year, and he would carry things back and forth until the temperature came down. He was good at that. He had always been the one who talked to the doctors when our mother was dying, the one who knew what to say to the funeral home. In this family, when something needed handling, you gave it to Paul and you stopped worrying about it. About 3 weeks after that, he came by my apartment with the envelope in his hand. I saw it in his truck, actually. I walked out and he was in the driveway with the window down, and he passed it through to me, and I turned it over, and there it was, in red block letters across the back. Refused. Return to sender. I looked at it for maybe 4 seconds. Maybe less. I gave it back to him the way you hand back a hot pan. He said, she gave it to me at her mother's. He said she did not want to put my address in her own mail. Then he said the thing I have thought about every day since I opened that drawer. He said, let me hold on to them. If she ever changes her mind, they will be somewhere she can find them. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I did not want that envelope in my apartment. I did not want to walk past it on my way to the coffee pot at 5 in the morning and be reminded of the shape of my own handwriting. So that became the system. I mailed the letters to her address in Colfax, because writing to her directly was the one piece of dignity I would not give up, and every few months Paul would tell me another one had come back to him, and I would put a line in my notebook and start the next one. I never held more than one of them at a time. I never held one longer than a few seconds. 9 years of that, and every single time, when I asked him how she was, my brother looked at the floor of his truck and said the same 11 words. She needs you to let her go. I put all 43 of them in a grocery bag, locked my dead brother's house, and drove home with them on the passenger seat. In 38 years at the bus barn, I learned one thing worth repeating. A part that fails the same way every single time is not an accident. It is a design. I put them on my kitchen table in the order they were mailed, which took me most of the evening and the notebook to get right, and then I got the loop out of my toolbox. It is a jeweler's loop, 10 power, with a chip out of the rim. I bought it in 1988 to read part numbers off bearings when my eyes started going. It has been in the 3rd drawer of that box ever since. Here is what a stamp does. A stamp is a man's hand, and a man's wrist, and a hand is never square to the paper twice. It rocks. One edge bites harder. The ink pools where the pressure was and starves where it was not. And if you look at 10 pieces of stamped mail, you will see 10 different accidents. Under the loop, every mark on my kitchen table was the same accident. The same lean to the right, about the amount a tired person's handwriting leans. The same thin white break through the crossbar of the letter E, in the word refused. The red sat on top of the paper like a decal. It had not soaked into the fiber the way ink soaks. When I put my thumbnail at the corner of one, the edge lifted, and I could feel a seam that had no business being there. They were labels. Somebody had printed them and stuck them on. I want to be honest about the next 2 days. because I have heard people tell these stories like they went straight from the clue to the conclusion, and that is not how a mind works when it has been carrying something for 9 years. I spent 2 days trying to prove myself wrong. I told myself the post office probably used a machine now. I told myself Emily might have bought a stamp of her own, some novelty thing, and used it on all of them, which would explain the sameness. I sat at that table at 4 in the morning building excuses for a woman who had never done anything except be angry at me for a good reason. Because here is what was on the other side of it. If those marks were fake, then the door I had been standing outside of for 9 years had never been locked, and I was the man who never tried the handle. On the 3rd morning, I put 7 envelopes in a manila folder and drove to the Ashford post office, and I got there before it opened, which tells you something about how I was sleeping. Denise Whitaker has run that branch for something like 30 years. She sold me the stamps for most of those letters. She took the folder to the end of the counter and spread them out and did not say anything for a while. Then she asked me who marked them. I said I had been told my daughter did. She turned one over and pointed with a pen. She said a genuine refusal does not look like this. She said when somebody refuses a piece of mail, it goes back into the system, and the system leaves tracks. A second postmark. An endorsement, usually the carrier's handwriting or a printed strip with the reason and the date. And it travels, which means it comes back scuffed because mail is not gentle. Then she peeled the corner up with her thumbnail the way I had, and she held it up to the window light. She said, "This is a die-cut adhesive label." She said, "That red is toner." She said, "I have one at home. My grandson uses it for his baseball cards." She said it kindly, which somehow made it worse. Then she turned the envelope over to the front and ran the barcode strip under the scanner they keep at the end of the counter, and I watched her face change. She said, "Huh." She said, "Mr. Mercer, this one never went where you sent it." She would not print me anything. She was careful about that, and I understood it later. Though standing there, I wanted to reach across the counter and take the screen. What she told me was general, and it was enough. She said the piece had been endorsed for forwarding. She said the routing on the back was not Colfax residential delivery. She said it had been directed to a post office box in Colfax, and that the same instruction was sitting on all 7 envelopes in my folder, which meant it was not one clerk's mistake on one bad morning. It was standing on the address itself. I asked her who had the box. She said she could not tell me that, and I want to say plainly that she was right not to. I have thought about that since. Everything I found because somebody had a legal reason to hand it to me. There was no clever moment. There was just a man asking the right people in the right order and getting told no about half the time. I already had the answer in my pocket anyway. I had been carrying my brother's key ring around for 11 days. The small brass one, flat and dull, with the number stamped into the shoulder. Ray Kessler had been Paul's attorney for 20 years and was the executor of his estate. His office is above a shoe repair on 4th, and he has a coffee maker that has never once been cleaned. I sat down across from him with the key on his blotter and asked what my brother had a post office box for. He did not even go to the file. He said Paul had kept a box in Colfax since before he retired, and that it was listed in the inventory, and that the rent was paid annually by automatic draft, and that as the sole heir I was entitled to see the estate paperwork, and did I want coffee. I said no to the coffee. He put a folder in front of me. In it was the box agreement, and behind the box agreement was a stack of small cards, and the top card had my daughter's name printed on it in my brother's block capitals. A change of address order. Emily Mercer. Her street in Colfax on one line, and on the next line as the new address, a post office box, and the number on that card matched the number stamped into the brass key sitting on Ray Kessler's blotter. At the bottom there was a signature. Emily's signature, or something close enough to it that I did not blink. I have seen my daughter's name in her own hand on report cards, on the back of birthday cards, on the check she sent me once when she was 19 and I could not make rent, which I never cashed and still have. It looked right. It looked exactly right. Then I looked at the date in the corner. I did not have to open my notebook. I have that other date memorized the way you memorize a phone number from childhood. I mailed the first letter on a Friday morning in August, at the counter in Ashford, with Denise Whitaker on the other side of the glass. The card was signed and dated on the Tuesday. 3 days before. Somebody had built the trap before I sent the first thing into it. I sat in Ray Kessler's office with his terrible coffee going cold on the corner of the desk, and I understood one thing without any doubt. This had not been done by a stranger, and it had not been done in a hurry. Somebody who knew my daughter's address, my daughter's signature, and my exact intentions had gone down to a counter and filled out a form 3 days before I mailed a letter. I had told almost nobody I was writing. I had told 2 people I was going to write to her, my brother and her mother. That night I did something I had not done in 9 years. I picked up the phone and dialed my daughter's number, the one I had never once used, because Paul had told me not to. She answered on the 4th ring with the flat, careful voice you use on a number you do not know. I said, "Emily, it is your dad." There was a pause with a television in it. Then she said, "How did you get this number?" And I told her the truth, which is that I had written it in the front of my notebook 9 years ago and never used it. I had rehearsed about 4 sentences on the drive home, and I got through none of them. What came out was that I had been cleaning out Uncle Paul's house and I had found some letters, and that I needed her to know they had never been opened. She said, "Letters." I said, 43. She laughed. Not a mean laugh. A tired one, which was worse. She said, "Dad, you wrote me twice." I said that was not true, and she cut across me, and for the first time in 9 years I heard my daughter actually raise her voice, and it was almost a relief. She said, "You wrote me twice. Right after you got out. Then you stopped, and then you moved, and you did not tell me where." She said, "Do you know what it is like to be 27 and find out from your uncle that your father has left the state?" I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear and looked at the grocery bag on the chair. I said, "Emily, I live in Ashford. I have lived in the same apartment on Delmar for 6 years. Before that I was in the place on 16th for 3. I have never lived anywhere that was not 40 minutes from your front door." The silence that came back had a different quality to it. I have heard that silence before. In the shop, when a man is looking at a bolt, he tightened himself and starting to understand what happened next. Then she said, "Uncle Paul told me you moved to Arizona." I said, "No." She said, "He told me in the spring. He said you had gone out there with somebody, and that you had asked all of us to stop contacting you, and he said it in my kitchen, with a cup of tea in his hand." Neither of us said anything for a while. Then whatever had opened, closed again, and she said the thing that I deserved. She said, "This is what you do." She said, "You find a reason. 9 years, and now the reason is a dead man who cannot say otherwise, and how convenient is that?" I said, "I know how it sounds." She said, "I have to go," and she hung up. I want to be fair to her here, because I have heard people tell stories like this and make the angry daughter into a problem to be solved. She was not being cruel. She was defending something. When you have spent 9 years making peace with the fact that your father chose a bottle over you, that peace becomes load-bearing. You do not knock it out because a man calls you on a Tuesday. 40 minutes later, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a photograph. A screen, photographed badly, the way people my daughter's age send things when they are in a hurry and their hands are not steady. A message thread. The name at the top was Uncle Paul. Under it, she had typed one line. She said, "He told me you asked us to leave you alone. There are years of these. Which one of you is lying to me?" I did not sleep. And by 6 in the morning I had built an answer I liked. And by 7 I was driving to it. Because there were only 2 people who had known I was going to write that first letter, and one of them was dead, and I did not want it to be him. That is the honest shape of what happened in my head that night. I went looking for a version where my brother was still my brother. Marianne has a condo out by the reservoir with a wreath on the door in every season. She was a bookkeeper for a dental group for 22 years, and she opened the door in her work clothes at 7 in the morning and did not look surprised to see me, which told me she had already talked to Emily. I put the copy of the forwarding card on her kitchen counter and asked her how long she had been doing it. She did not touch the card. She read it from where she stood, with her arms folded, and I watched her go a color I've only seen on her twice in my life. I said things in that kitchen I am not going to repeat here. The center of it was that she had hated me enough to keep my daughter from me for 9 years, and that she had used our daughter's name to do it, and that if she wanted to punish somebody, she could have punished me directly instead of letting Emily believe she had been abandoned twice. She let me finish. She has always let me finish. Then she sat down at her own kitchen table like her legs had gone, and she said, "I asked Paul to hold your mail." I said, "There it is." She said, "For 90 days. Then she got up, and she went to the hall closet, and she came back with a plastic file box, because Marianne has kept every piece of paper that has ever entered her house, and that habit is the only reason I know what I know. Inside was a note in my brother's handwriting, on the back of a church bulletin, folded into a square. Marianne had written the date on the corner in pen, the way she dates everything. It said, "Understood. I will hold anything that comes for E until he is out and steady on his feet. 90 days. Then it goes to her. You are doing the right thing." I read it 4 times. She told me the rest sitting down. Emily had been 26 and not sleeping. I had been writing from the facility, and what I was writing in those first weeks was not fit for anybody to read, because a man in the second week of detox writes like a man in the second week of detox. She had asked Paul to be the wall until I came home and could say things properly. She said, 90 days, Daniel. It expired the week you got out. I told him myself at Thanksgiving that it was done. I said, then why does this card have her signature on it? And Marianne looked at the card for a long time and said, because that is not my handwriting, and it is not hers either. And then she put her hand over her mouth. I went back to Ray Kessler that afternoon and asked him to pull every card in that folder. There were 7. One every year and a half or so, each one renewing the one before it, each one carrying that same careful, right-looking signature. The last one had been signed 8 years after Marianne's 90 days ran out. Emily picked the place. A diner on the Colfax side, the kind with laminated menus and a pie case nobody has opened since the spring, and she was already in the booth when I got there, with a folder square in front of her and her hands flat on top of it. I had not seen my daughter in 9 years. She has her mother's jaw and my father's eyes, and there is gray coming in at her left temple, which knocked something loose in me, because in my head she had stayed 26. She did not hug me. She said, sit down, and I sat down. She had printed them out. That is the thing I keep coming back to. She had gone home after our phone call and printed 9 years of messages from her uncle onto paper, because she wanted to be able to put them on a table in front of a man and watch him read them. There were dozens. I read maybe 15 before I had to stop. He is drinking again. I am not going to sugarcoat it for you, kiddo. He does not want contact with the family right now. I know that hurts. He is out in Arizona. I will let you know if that changes. He asked me to stop passing messages. I think you should let him have that. That last one had a date on it in the corner. I looked it up that night against my notebook. I mailed letter number 31 to her 9 days later. She said, I sent you a card. The second Christmas. I gave it to him and asked him to get it to you. I said, I never got it. She said, I know that now. And then she looked out the window at the parking lot for a while, and she said, do you understand that I thanked him? Every year I thanked him for putting up with the 2 of you. I asked her the thing I had come to ask, which was whether he had been at her birthdays. She said, he was at every one. She said he brought a bakery cake with too much frosting and he sat at the end of the table, and one year he made a toast about how families do not always come in the shape you order them in, and she said everybody laughed, and she said the word laughed like it was a stone she was spitting out. We sat with that. Then she said the hardest sentence anybody has ever said to me, and she said it without any heat at all, which is how I know she had been carrying it a long time. She said, I stopped needing you about 4 years ago. I would like to know if that counts for anything now. I said it counted. I said it was mine, not hers. Before we left, she asked to see one. I had 2 in my jacket. I gave her the one from the 3rd Christmas, and she turned it over and looked at the red label, and she opened it with a butter knife off the table, and she read about 2 lines. Then she put it back in the envelope, and she set it on the table between us, and she said, I cannot do this today. She called 2 days later and told me to stop. I had been expecting the opposite call, which is my own fault for expecting anything. She said she had spent 48 hours going through her own life like a burglar, and she could not do it, and she needed me to hear why. She said, he taught me to drive. In the lot behind the hardware store, in his truck, and he let me grind the gears and he never once yelled. She said, when my appendix went, he slept in a chair in that room for 2 nights. She said, he paid part of my last 2 semesters and made me promise not to tell Mom. Then she said, and now you want me to take all of that and turn it into something else, and I have to ask myself why the timing is so good for you. She said, you get to be the wronged one. After everything. You get to walk in here and be the one it was done to. I did not have an answer for that. She was not entirely wrong about the timing either. There is a part of a man who has spent 9 years being the family's cautionary tale that reaches for a story where he is not. She said, I need you to leave it alone. And then she stopped answering the phone. So I went back to my brother's house on a Saturday, and I sat on the floor and I opened the shoebox. Paul was a photographer the way our mother was, which is to say he took pictures of the food and the tables and only sometimes the people. There were 4 rubber bands around that box and they had gone brittle and they snapped when I pulled them. He had written on the backs dates, first names, sometimes the occasion. Emily, 28. Emily, 29. Ice cream cake. Thanksgiving. Emily brought the rolls. Emily, 31. New apartment. There is one of him at her kitchen table with a paper crown on his head. There is one of him standing behind her with both hands on her shoulders while she blows out candles, and I know that pose. Our father stood like that. At the bottom of the box, in a drugstore envelope, was a set from a field house I recognized, because I have driven past that building maybe 200 times since, always with my eyes on the road. Her graduation. He was there. In 3 of them you can see him in the stands with a program rolled up in his fist, and in one of them he is standing at the bottom of the steps with his arm around her while she holds the folder with the diploma in it, and she is laughing. And her cap is crooked, and the sun is on the left side of her face. I sat on my dead brother's floor and did the arithmetic that mattered. On the day I was drinking in a motel parking lot 4 miles away, my brother was in that building, in the seat where I should have been, and in the 9 years since, he had never once mentioned it. Not once. Not at Christmas, not in his truck, not in any of the 40 or 50 conversations in which he had told me she needed me to let her go. That was the moment it stopped being about the letters. Ray Kessler released the laptop to me the following week with a form to sign and a look on his face that suggested he had started to guess. I am 64 and I can rebuild an air compressor with my eyes shut, and I cannot make a computer do anything. My neighbor's daughter is 19 and works at the phone store, and she came over on a Sunday and sat at my kitchen table and got it open in about 4 minutes. The password was Emily's birthday. She typed it in on the 2nd try and looked up at me and said, "Is that your granddaughter?" And I said, "No, my daughter." And she said, "Oh, that is sweet." And I had to go stand at the sink for a minute. I want to say I found it fast. I did not. I spent a week in that machine the way you go through a house looking for a smell. Folders inside folders. Bank statements. A recipe file. 200 pictures of his garden. The label file was in a folder called Household. It was a template. That is what the girl at the phone store called it when I asked her to explain what I was looking at. A design saved and named and used, sized to a die-cut label roll, red block letters, the word refused, then returned to sender under it, and the whole thing sitting a few degrees off level inside the box. 9 degrees off, said the little display in the corner. Not straight. Set that way on purpose. Once, years ago, by a man who understood that a real stamp is never straight and who never thought to change the angle after that, because why would you change it when it had worked the first time? Under it in the same folder, there was a document with a scan in it. A birthday card, opened flat. Inside, in the round handwriting of a girl of about 15, "Love always, Emily," with the Y trailing off. He had scanned it. He had blown it up. There were 4 versions of that signature in that folder, each one cleaner than the last. I sat there and thought about a man at a kitchen table with a scanner and a pen, practicing his niece's name until his hand knew it. The messages were in the mail program, going back years, exactly the ones she had printed and put on the diner table. He had kept them all. He kept everything. And then, in the folder with his tax records, where nobody would go looking, there was a document with a name on it that was not a number and not a year. It was called, "For Emily, when I am gone." The date on it said he had last touched it 11 days before he died. I opened it, and it was a page and a half long, and it stopped in the middle of a line. I am not going to read the whole thing out. Some of it was his, and it stays his. It started the way a man starts a letter he has been writing in his head for years and has never once written down. It said, "If you are reading this, then I am past being embarrassed." He wrote that Marianne had asked him to hold my mail for 90 days, and that he had agreed because it was the right thing, and that at the end of the 90 days, he had gone down to the counter with the form already in his hand. He wrote, "I told myself it was 2 more months. I told myself he would drink again by Christmas, and then I would be glad I had spared her." He wrote about my second letter, the one I mailed in October. He wrote, "I held it up to the light and I could see he had written her a lot of words, and I thought, she is finally sleeping." And I thought, Not yet. That was the whole engine of it. Not yet. Renewed every 18 months at a counter, in a hand that had learned to make a 15-year-old girl's Y trail off. He wrote about the birthdays. He wrote, "I know what I did there, and I am not going to dress it up." He wrote that the first time he was invited he was standing in for me, and that somewhere in there it stopped feeling like standing in. And then the part I have read more times than is good for me. He wrote, "If he comes back, I go back to being the uncle." That was it. That was the whole of it. After 9 years and 43 envelopes and a woman grieving a father who lived 40 minutes away. My brother was not a monster, and he was not after money, and there was nothing in that desk worth $1. He had simply found out, close to 60 years old, what it feels like to be somebody's first phone call, and he could not go back to being the second one. The last lines were about the letters. He wrote, "I never opened one. I know that does not count for anything. I want it to, and it does not." He wrote, "I always thought there would be a right time to bring them to you, and I have carried them from one house to another, and I have never once found it." And then, halfway through a sentence it says, "What I need you to understand is that I was not trying to." That is where it stops. Middle of the line. No period. He got up from that chair to do something else, and 11 days later the kettle was on and he was on his own kitchen floor, and that sentence never got finished. People ask me if I hated him when I read it. I did not, and I have made my peace with the fact that this disappoints some of them. I sat in my kitchen at midnight with my brother's laptop open, and I thought about him driving 80 miles north with my duffel bag on the back seat, not saying anything, letting me be quiet. Both of those men were the same man. I have had to learn to hold that without letting go of either end. The rage came about 2 days later, and it did not come for me. It came for a woman of 26 looking into the stands for a father who was not there, and for the 9 years of her life somebody decided she did not get to spend deciding for herself. Ray Kessler told me what my options were, and he told me straight. He said interfering with somebody else's mail is a federal matter and a serious one, and that it does not survive the person who did it. There was nobody to charge. There was an estate, and I was the whole of it, which meant the only person I could sue was myself. Then he said the part that was actually the decision. He said, "There are people who are going to remember your brother a certain way, and you are holding the thing that changes it, and nobody can make you keep quiet about it." The church had put off the luncheon for him until the end of the month. 40 or 50 people. His bowling league, 2 men from the plant, the woman who ran the food pantry he drove for on Wednesdays. I had already been asked to stand up and say a few words about my brother, and I had already said yes, back when saying yes was easy. I want to tell you I did not think about it. I thought about it for a week. I thought about standing at the front of that hall with the folder and reading them the part about the label printer. I could see the faces. I could see the pantry woman putting her hand on her chest. What stopped me was not forgiveness. Let me be exact, because this is the one place where I do not want to be misunderstood. What stopped me was that it was not my story to tell first. He took 9 years from her, not from me. What I lost was the version of myself I could have been in her eyes, and I had done a fair amount of damage to that myself. She was the one who thanked him at every birthday. She was the one who slept in the room while he sat in the chair. Whatever was going to happen to my brother's name, my daughter was going to decide it, and she was going to decide it when she was ready, and not on a Sunday afternoon that happened to be convenient for me. So I stood up at that luncheon, and I said that my brother was organized and stubborn, and that he showed up when our mother was dying, which is all true, and I sat back down, and it was the hardest 20 seconds of the whole business. Marianne called me most nights that month. She kept coming back to the same phrase like a person pressing a bruise. 90 days. I only ever said 90 days. I told her more than once that she had asked her brother-in-law for a wall and had gotten a wall, and that what he built on top of it after she took her hand off it was not hers. I do not know that she believes me yet. She has that bulletin note in a plastic sleeve in her file box, and I think she reads it more than she should. Emily called on a Thursday at 11 at night. She did not say hello. She said, "Are they in order?" I said, "They are. I have the notebook. I know what day every one of them went out." She said, "I want them." And then she said, "But I am not doing it in front of you." I drove them to Colfax that night in the same grocery bag. She met me on the porch and took it with both arms, the way you take something heavier than it looks, and she said 1 a week, in order, and she said, "Do not ask me about them." I said, "Okay." She said, "I mean it, Dad. Do not ask." Then she went inside, and I drove home, And for the first time in 9 years, the letters were where I had always meant them to go, and I did not get to see a single one of them opened. It took her most of a year. Sometimes she called after one and sometimes she did not, and I learned to sit in my kitchen and not look at the phone, which is a skill I did not have before. She called after the fourth one, which was the one I had been dreading, because it was written in the second winter, and it is 4 pages of a man apologizing for things she never knew about. She said, "You told me about the time you dropped me." I said, "I did." She said, "I do not remember any of that." She said, "Why would you tell me that?" And I said, "Because I did not want there to be anything left over." She called after the 11th, which is mostly about a bus with a cracked head gasket, because I had run out of feelings that week and wrote about work instead. She said that was her favorite one so far, and I said that was the least of them, and she said, "No, that one sounded like you." She did not call after the 19th. That is the one about the day she was born. Around the 30th, she started asking me questions in the middle of the week, small ones, about whether I still had the green toolbox, about whether I had eaten. That is how it comes back. Not with a scene, with a woman asking a man whether he has eaten. We do the first Sunday of the month. At the diner with the pie nobody touches. In the spring she drove out to Ashford and stood in my apartment and looked at the wall where I keep the photographs of her at 10 and 11 and 12, which is where the pictures stop, and she did not say anything about it. And neither did I. She has said 2 things to me that I am not allowed to argue with, and I do not. The first is that she is not going to pretend the 9 years did not happen. She is 35, and she built a whole life out of being a woman whose father did not want her, and you cannot hand that back and expect the shelf to be empty underneath it. The second is about Paul. She has not thrown out his photographs. She took the framed one off her wall and put it in a drawer, and she told me she does not know if it stays there, and I told her she has the rest of her life to decide, and nobody gets a vote but her. Marianne knows all of it. The 3 of us have not been in a room together, and I do not know if we will be. Here is the thing I have landed on. And I am not a man who talks like this, so I will say it once. What my brother did was not hatred. Hatred would have been easier to explain to her. He loved that girl, and he decided on his own in a post office in Colfax that she did not get to choose who she forgave. That is where love turns into ownership. Not when a man wants to be needed, which is only human, but the minute he starts arranging the world so that he is the only one available. If somebody in your family told you to stop reaching out to a person, and you stopped, I would ask you to think about who told you and what it got them. Say it in the comments if you want. I have read every one of them. Last month I mailed the 44th letter. The forwarding order is dead now, cancelled by the estate, and it would not have mattered anyway, because Emily wrote her address out for me on the back of a card at the diner in her own handwriting, which I had not seen in 9 years and which does not look one thing like the signature on those cards. I took it to the counter in Ashford, and Denise Whitaker sold me the stamp and cancelled it right there in front of me with her hand, and the mark came down crooked, smeared at the top edge, biting hard on the left the way a real one does. Never the same way twice. That is how you know a human being touched it.